He had everything money could buy, but in that moment, he chose to walk past the one thing that mattered. The airport buzzed with movement, rolling suitcases clicking against polished floors, overhead announcements echoing in clipped, practiced tones, and somewhere between Gate 32 and a crowded waiting area, a baby's cry cut through it all, sharp, desperate, impossible to ignore, yet most people did exactly that. They kept walking, eyes glued to their phones, shoulders brushing past without slowing down, as if the sound belonged to someone else's problem, and in the middle of it stood Hannah Reid. Her hair loosely tied, strands falling across her damp cheeks, her jacket too thin for the aggressive air conditioning, her hands trembling as she held her infant close against her chest, whispering soft reassurances that didn't seem to work, the baby's cries rising again, louder this time, drawing glances that quickly turned away. And then there was Adrian Cole, stepping out of a sleek black SUV just outside the terminal moments earlier, now moving through the crowd with quiet authority, his tailored charcoal suit unwrinkled, his pace steady, purposeful, a man used to being followed, not stopped, two airport staff members walking a few steps behind him, murmuring into headsets, clearing space without making a scene. He didn't look left or right, didn't need to, the world usually adjusted itself around him, but then he heard it, that cry, cutting through the noise like something out of place, and for a fraction of a second, his stride slowed, just enough to notice, just enough to see her, Hannah, standing near a row of plastic chairs, shifting her weight, her eyes scanning the crowd with a mix of hope and panic, and then she saw him. Not because she knew who he was, but because he looked like someone who could help, someone who wouldn't ignore her, and before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward, her voice breaking as she reached out. Please, just 1 minute, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his suit, light, hesitant, like she already expected to be refused. Adrian stopped, not fully, just enough to turn his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second, long enough to register the exhaustion, the desperation, the child clinging to her, and then just as quickly, something in his expression hardened, not cruel, just distant, practiced, the kind of look that said he had already decided, his arm gently but firmly pulling away from her touch, not a word spoken, not even a shake of the head, just silence, heavier than any rejection, and then he moved again, stepping past her as if she had never been there, the faint scent of his cologne lingering for a second before disappearing into the flow of people. Hannah stood frozen, her hand still slightly raised, as if the moment hadn't caught up with her yet, the baby crying louder now, pressing into her shoulder, and around her, the world resumed its rhythm, footsteps, voices, announcements, all blending together, while a few feet away, a little girl with soft brown curls and bright curious eyes watched the scene unfold from beside a row of seats, her small hand gripping the strap of a pink backpack, her gaze following Adrian as he walked away, her expression shifting in a way no one noticed, not yet. Because at that moment, no one realized how quickly everything was about to change. Adrian did not look back, not when the sound of the baby's crying faded slightly behind him, not when the automatic glass doors slid open and closed in steady rhythm, not even when something inside him, quiet and unfamiliar, tried to slow his steps again, because slowing down was not something he allowed himself to do, not in business, not in life, and certainly not for strangers in crowded places. He adjusted his cufflinks as he walked, the subtle glint of silver catching the overhead lights, his assistant's voice murmuring through a small earpiece about a delayed meeting in Chicago, a contract waiting for his approval, a board expecting his presence, everything moving forward exactly as planned, controlled, predictable, the way he preferred it, yet just a few feet behind him. The rhythm of the airport had begun to shift in a way no one immediately noticed. The little girl with the pink backpack, Sophie, had taken a small step away from the row of seats where she had been standing, her eyes still following the direction her father had gone, her small fingers loosening from the strap as curiosity pulled her forward, one step, then another. The kind of quiet movement that gets lost in a sea of rushing adults, her shoes making soft taps against the polished floor, blending into the endless noise around her, and back near Gate 32, Hannah adjusted the baby in her arms, her breathing uneven as she tried to calm both the child and herself, whispering gently, "It is okay, I am here." Even though her voice carried a tremor she could not hide, she reached into her worn tote bag, searching for a bottle. Her fingers brushing against crumpled receipts and a nearly empty wallet, the reality of her situation pressing down harder with every passing second, the kind of pressure that makes even standing feel difficult, and yet she did not sit, she stayed alert, her eyes scanning the crowd again, because something about that man, the one who had just walked away, lingered in her mind, not anger, not even disappointment, just a strange feeling she could not name, as if that brief moment had mattered more than it should have, and somewhere between those two separate worlds, one built on urgency and survival, the other on power and precision, a gap had formed, invisible but growing. Adrian reached the private security checkpoint reserved for elite passengers, a quiet corridor away from the chaos, where voices lowered and movements became more deliberate. A staff member greeted him by name, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and Adrian nodded once, stepping forward, ready to move on, ready to leave everything behind. But then a sound broke through the controlled silence, sharp, panicked, a woman's voice rising above the hum of the terminal. "Sophie," it echoed, louder this time. "Sophie, where are you?" And for the first time that day, Adrian stopped completely. Not out of habit, but because something in that voice cut deeper than the noise he had ignored earlier. He turned, slowly at first, his expression tightening as the voice called again, closer now, more frantic, and when he saw her, the woman who had been sitting just moments ago now standing, spinning in place, her face pale, her hands empty. His chest tightened in a way he could not immediately explain, his mind trying to catch up, trying to process what his eyes were telling him. The small pink backpack no longer where it should have been, the space beside the chair suddenly too empty, too quiet, and in that instant, the world he controlled so carefully slipped just slightly out of place, not dramatically, not yet, but enough for him to feel it, enough for him to understand that something had gone wrong, something he could not fix. With a phone call or a signature, and behind him, far from the polished calm of the private terminal, Hannah looked up as the distant echo of that same voice reached her, faint but urgent, and without knowing why, her heart began to race. The name echoed again, louder this time, stretching across the terminal like a crack in glass, and Adrian felt it land somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere he had not visited in years, his body already moving before his thoughts could catch up, stepping past the quiet checkpoint, past the staff who suddenly looked uncertain, their polite composure replaced with alert glances and quick whispers into radios. The controlled world he had just entered dissolving behind him as he pushed back into the crowded terminal, his eyes scanning rapidly now, no longer distant, no longer detached, but searching, urgently, the way a man searches when something irreplaceable is no longer where it should be. "Sophie," he called, his voice steady at first, practiced, as if saying her name would be enough to bring her back into view. But there was no answer. Only the constant movement of strangers, the hum of rolling luggage, the echo of overhead announcements that suddenly felt too loud, too meaningless, and a few feet away, the woman who had been calling out stood frozen for a second, her hands trembling as she looked around, her composure breaking in real time. "She was right here," she said to no one in particular, her voice shaking. "She was just right here." And Adrian reached her in 2 long strides, his presence immediate, commanding, but no longer calm. "Where did you last see her?" he asked, his tone sharp, direct, the kind that usually demanded answers, but this time it carried something else beneath it, something close to fear. The woman looked up at him, recognition flickering in her eyes as if she knew who he was, but it did not matter now. Nothing did except the empty space beside her. "I turned for 1 second, she said, her voice breaking, "just 1 second, and that was all it took. 1 second, Adrian felt the words settle heavily in his chest, repeating in his mind, 1 second, the same kind of second he had dismissed moments ago when someone else had asked for help, and for the first time, that memory did not fade, it stayed, sharp and clear. Hannah's hand reaching out, her voice asking for just 1 minute, and his decision to keep walking, as if time belonged only to him, as if nothing could happen in the space he chose to ignore. And now the terminal felt different. No longer just a place of movement, but a maze of unknowns, every face unfamiliar, every direction uncertain. Security personnel began to move more visibly now, their radios crackling with short updates. Eyes scanning, coordinating, the energy shifting from routine to alert, and Adrian stepped back slightly, his gaze sweeping the area again, forcing himself to think, to analyze, the way he did in every high-pressure situation. But this was not a negotiation. not a deal he could structure or control. This was something else entirely, something that did not follow rules. And then, through the noise, through the movement, a smaller detail surfaced, something almost invisible, a memory of Pink, of small footsteps moving away from the chairs, a direction not toward the gates, but toward the wider terminal, and without realizing it, his body turned that way, instinct taking over where logic struggled, and across the terminal, Hannah had already started moving, her eyes narrowing slightly as she replayed what she had seen earlier, not clearly, not perfectly, but enough to feel that something was not right. She shifted the baby higher against her shoulder, steadying her breath, and took a step forward, not because anyone had asked her to, not because she owed anything to anyone, but because something inside her would not let her stand still, and as she moved, the distance between her and Adrian began to close again, not by chance this time, but by something quieter, something that felt a lot like consequence. The distance between them closed in seconds, but it felt longer, stretched by everything that had just happened, Adrian moving fast now, his eyes sharper, more aware, while Hannah stepped into his path with a quiet certainty that did not match her worn appearance. "I think she went that way," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, and for a brief moment, Adrian did not respond, not because he did not hear her, but because he recognized her, the same woman he had walked past, the same voice he had ignored, and something in his expression shifted, not fully, not enough to erase what had happened, but enough to hesitate, enough to listen. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone still controlled, but no longer dismissive, and Hannah nodded slightly, adjusting the baby against her shoulder as she spoke. "I saw a little girl. Pink backpack, she was looking for someone." She started walking toward the main concourse, near the food court. Her words were simple, direct, not exaggerated, not emotional, just observation, the kind people often overlook until it matters, and Adrian followed her gaze, his mind piecing together the direction, mapping the terminal in seconds, the way he would analyze a deal, but this time the stakes were different. This time it was not numbers or contracts, it was time, minutes passing, opportunities slipping, and without another word, he turned in that direction, his stride faster now, urgent, and Hannah followed, not close, not intruding, just moving with purpose, her presence quiet but steady, the baby now calmer against her, as if sensing the shift in her focus, and as they moved deeper into the terminal, the environment changed. The polished quiet of the VIP area replaced with brighter lights, louder voices, the smell of coffee and fast food filling the air, families gathered around tables, travelers checking watches, children laughing, a normal scene, untouched by the tension building just a few steps away, and Adrian scanned every face, every small figure, his heartbeat louder now, his breath slightly uneven, something he would have never allowed anyone to notice before, but there was no room for control anymore, not here, not now. "Sophie," he called again, louder this time, his voice cutting through the noise, drawing glances from strangers who paused for a second before returning to their own lives, and then Hannah stopped, just for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she focused on something specific, not movement, not sound, but absence. A small detail out of place, near a row of vending machines at the edge of the concourse, a pink strap caught briefly against the side of a metal panel, almost hidden, almost invisible unless someone was really looking. "There," she said softly, pointing, and Adrian followed her line of sight instantly, his chest tightening as recognition hit, the color, the shape, unmistakable, and he moved toward it quickly, closing the distance in seconds, his hand reaching out, touching the edge of the backpack strap as if confirming it was real, as if grounding himself in something tangible, and in that moment, the noise of the airport faded again, replaced by a sharper awareness, the realization that they were close, that whatever had happened had not taken her far, not yet, and behind him, Hannah remained still, watching, not stepping forward, not claiming anything, just present, and for the first time since this began, Adrian did not see her as a stranger in the way, but as someone who had noticed what he had missed, someone who had stopped when others kept walking, and somewhere between the sound of his own breath and the distant echo of announcements overhead, a quiet truth settled in, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood, that sometimes the difference between losing something and finding it again comes down to one person choosing to pay attention when everyone else does not. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the small pink strap, the material soft but suddenly heavy with meaning, his mind racing through possibilities he could not fully control, his eyes lifting from the backpack to scan the immediate area again, sharper now, more focused, as if the world had narrowed into a few critical feet of space, and then he saw it, not directly in front of him, but just beyond, near a row of empty seats partially hidden by a tall advertisement display. A small movement, subtle, almost lost between passing travelers, and without hesitation he stepped forward, faster now, his polished composure completely gone, replaced by something raw and urgent. "Sophie," he called again, his voice breaking just slightly this time, and a small figure turned, slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure whether the voice was real or imagined, and there she was, standing just a few yards away, her pink backpack slightly twisted, one strap loose, her eyes wide but not panicked, just confused, as though the world had shifted around her without warning, and in that instant, everything else disappeared for Adrian, the noise, the crowd, the pressure, all of it fading into the background as he closed the distance between them in seconds, dropping to one knee the moment he reached her. His hands hovering for a fraction of a second before gently resting on her shoulders, grounding both of them in something real, something certain. "I am here," he said quietly, his voice no longer commanding, no longer distant, but soft, almost unfamiliar, and Sophie blinked, her small fingers reaching toward him as if confirming he was not going to disappear again. "I could not see you," she said, her voice small but steady, and Adrian exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, pulling her into a careful embrace, not tight, not overwhelming, just enough to remind himself that she was safe, that she was here, and a few steps behind him, Hannah watched, her expression calm, not relieved in an exaggerated way, just quietly certain, as if she had expected this outcome the moment she saw the direction the child had taken. She shifted her baby slightly, rocking him with gentle instinct, her eyes scanning once more to ensure there was no lingering danger, even though none had ever fully formed, just the fear of what could have been, and after a few seconds, Adrian stood, still holding Sophie's hand, his grip firm but gentle, and he turned, his gaze landing on Hannah again, this time without hesitation, without distance, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the airport slowly returning around them, announcements resuming, footsteps passing by, life continuing as if nothing had happened, but something had changed, something quiet but undeniable. Adrian stepped toward her, his posture different now, less guarded, less certain of his usual control. "You saw what I did not," he said, his voice steady but carrying something deeper beneath it, something closer to humility than authority. And Hannah shook her head slightly, her lips forming a faint, tired smile. "I just paid attention," she replied simply, her words light but carrying more weight than anything else in that moment. And Adrian glanced down briefly at his daughter, then back at Hannah, the memory of earlier still fresh, still clear, the moment he had chosen to walk past her, the moment he had decided her voice did not matter, and now standing here, holding the one thing he could not afford to lose, he understood something he had not before. Not fully, not in a way that stayed with him, that sometimes the smallest choice, the briefest moment of attention, can change everything. And as the crowd moved around them, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place, Adrian did not look away this time. For a moment, no one moved, not really, because relief has a way of slowing time, stretching seconds into something softer, something quieter, and Adrian felt it settle into his chest as he looked down at Sophie, her small hand wrapped around his finger, her presence grounding him in a way no boardroom victory ever had, and yet even in that stillness, the memory of what had just happened did not fade, it stayed close, sharp, reminding him how quickly control can slip, how easily something precious can be lost in a space filled with people who are too busy to notice. And he turned again to Hannah, really seeing her now, not as part of the background, not as a moment to pass through, but as someone who had stepped forward when it mattered, someone who had chosen to act when it would have been easier to walk away. And there was a pause, brief but significant, before he spoke again. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, but unfamiliar in the way he delivered them, not as a formality, not as a habit, but as something intentional, something meant. And Hannah gave a small nod, adjusting the baby against her shoulder as she shifted her weight slightly, her body showing signs of exhaustion she had not acknowledged earlier, her movements slower now that the urgency had passed. And for a second, Adrian noticed it, the way her hand lingered just a little longer when supporting the child, the way her shoulders dipped slightly under the quiet weight of everything she was carrying, and it brought back that earlier moment again, clearer now, heavier, the moment she had asked him for just 1 minute, and he had not given it, and the realization did not sit well, it stayed pressing against the space he usually filled with certainty, and he glanced briefly at the baby, then back at her, his voice shifting again, softer this time. "What did you need?" he asked, the question direct, but no longer distant, and Hannah hesitated, not out of fear, but because she was not used to being asked twice, not used to someone circling back after choosing to walk away, and she exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I just needed to get to gate 18, she said, her voice calm but tired. "They would not let me board because I was late, and I did not have enough to rebook." She did not add more, did not explain everything, but it was enough for Adrian to understand the situation in a way that felt immediate, tangible, and he looked past her for a second, toward the departure boards glowing overhead, then back at her, and something shifted again, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet decision forming, the kind that does not need to be announced. And he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone, his movements efficient but no longer rushed, his attention fully present now. "What is your name?" he asked, and she answered without hesitation, "Hannah," and he nodded once, already dialing, his tone returning to something controlled but purposeful as he spoke into the phone, arranging something quickly, calmly. The kind of conversation that usually opened doors without question, and within moments, a staff member approached, slightly out of breath but attentive, glancing between Adrian and Hannah with a mix of confusion and recognition, and Adrian gestured lightly toward her. "She needs to be on the next flight to wherever gate 18 was boarding," he said, his voice even, but leaving no room for delay, and the staff member nodded quickly, already turning to handle it, and Hannah stood there for a second, unsure how to respond, the shift in circumstances happening faster than she expected, and Adrian looked at her again, not with distance this time, but with something closer to understanding. "No one should be left behind for asking for help," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and as the noise of the airport continued around them, unchanged and indifferent, something between them had changed, something small, but real, the kind of change that does not need attention to matter. The staff member moved quickly, speaking into a handheld radio as she gestured for Hannah to follow, her tone efficient but noticeably more attentive now, and for the first time since arriving at the airport, Hannah felt something shift beneath her feet, not the ground itself, but the direction her day was taking, as if a path that had been closing suddenly opened just enough to let her breathe. She adjusted her grip on her baby, whose small breaths had finally settled into a quiet rhythm. And she took a step forward, then another, still slightly unsure, as if expecting the moment to dissolve, but it did not. It held, steady and real, and behind her, Adrian remained where he stood for a second longer, watching, not out of obligation, but because something about the way she moved, the quiet strength in her posture despite everything, stayed with him, and Sophie tugged gently at his hand, her small voice breaking the silence between his thoughts. "Daddy, is she going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes still fixed on Hannah, and Adrian looked down at her, then back toward Hannah again, his expression softening in a way that would have been unfamiliar to anyone who only knew him from boardrooms and headlines. "She will be," he said quietly, though part of him understood that it was not just about a flight, not just about a gate number or a ticket, it was about something much larger, something he had only just begun to notice, and as Hannah followed the staff member through the terminal, weaving between travelers and bright overhead signs, she felt the weight in her chest begin to ease, not disappear, but shift. Like a door that had been locked finally opening just enough to let light through, the staff member stopped near a service desk, speaking quickly to another agent who nodded and began typing, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed, and within moments, a boarding pass slid across the counter, the small piece of paper carrying more than just a seat number. It carried possibility, relief, a chance to keep going, and Hannah accepted it carefully, as if it might vanish if she held it too loosely, her voice soft as she said thank you, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for it to be heard, and as she turned slightly, her eyes instinctively searched the crowd again, landing once more on Adrian, standing a short distance away, his presence still distinct even in the moving crowd, and for a second, their eyes met again. Not with urgency this time, not with need, but with recognition, something quiet passing between them that did not require explanation, and Adrian gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just simple, human, and Hannah returned it, her lips forming the faintest hint of a smile before she turned back toward the gate, guided now by someone who had chosen to help, and as she walked, the noise of the airport seemed different, not quieter, but less overwhelming, as if she was no longer standing still while the world moved around her, but finally moving with it, and back near the concourse, Adrian watched until she disappeared into the flow of passengers, his hand still resting lightly on Sophie's shoulder, and for a moment, he did not check his phone, did not return to the schedule waiting for him. Did not rush forward into the next obligation, because something in that brief encounter had interrupted the pattern he had followed for years, something small but undeniable. And as Sophie looked up at him again, her expression curious but calm, Adrian realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what came next, but about what he had almost missed. Adrian stood there a moment longer even after Hannah disappeared into the crowd, his mind replaying the sequence again, not the search, not the fear, but the moment before all of it, the moment he chose not to stop, and it stayed with him in a way that was unfamiliar, uncomfortable even, because it did not fit into the clean, controlled structure he had built his life around, and Sophie shifted closer to him, her small hand still wrapped around his, grounding him in the present. "Daddy, why?" Was she crying? She asked softly, her voice carrying a simple curiosity that held no judgment, just a need to understand, and Adrian looked down at her, then out toward the direction Hannah had gone, as if the answer might still be there. "Sometimes people just need help," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain than before. And Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing the idea in a way only a child could, without complication, without layers. "Then why did you not help her?" she asked, her question landing gently but directly, and Adrian did not answer right away, because for the first time, he did not have a quick explanation, no structured reasoning, no clear defense, just a simple truth he had not wanted to face, and he exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a brief second before meeting hers again. "I should have," he said finally, the words honest, unpolished, and Sophie studied his face for a moment before giving a small nod, as if that was enough, as if acknowledging it mattered more than explaining it, and somewhere in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, something deeper, not just about the moment that had passed, but about the pattern it revealed. The way he had been moving through the world, focused, efficient, but distant, and as he stood there, the noise of the airport continuing around him, he realized how many moments like that he had probably walked past without ever noticing, how many voices he had chosen not to hear because they did not fit into his priorities, and for the first time, that thought did not fade quickly, it stayed, pressing against his usual clarity, and he glanced at his phone as it buzzed lightly in his hand, a reminder of meetings waiting, decisions pending, the world he knew pulling him back into its rhythm, but this time, he did not answer it immediately, he let it ring once more before silencing it, his attention returning instead to Sophie, who was now looking around with renewed calm, her earlier confusion replaced by quiet security. And he adjusted his grip on her hand slightly, more aware now, more present, as if holding on to more than just her, as if holding on to the moment itself, and as they began to walk slowly back toward the quieter part of the terminal, Adrian's pace was different, less hurried, less automatic, his eyes no longer fixed straight ahead, but moving, noticing, small details he would have ignored before, a tired traveler sitting alone, a family laughing near a gate, a woman adjusting her child's jacket. Moments that had always been there but had never held his attention, and for the first time, he did not see them as background, but as something real, something connected, and as they reached the edge of the private terminal again, the staff member waiting nearby straightened slightly, ready to resume the schedule, but Adrian paused, just briefly. His gaze shifting once more toward the crowded concourse behind them, where Hannah had walked away, and though he could no longer see her, the impact of her presence remained, quiet but undeniable, and as he turned back toward his own path, stepping forward into the world he knew, something within it had changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough for him to understand that the next time someone reached out, the next time a voice broke through the noise, he might not keep walking. Time did not slow down for anyone else in the airport, flights continued to board, announcements continued to echo, And somewhere far down the terminal, Hannah stood near gate 18, holding her boarding pass a little tighter than necessary, as if the thin piece of paper carried more than just permission to board, as if it carried proof that for once, something had worked in her favor, and she glanced down at her baby, brushing a gentle hand over his small head, her movements softer now, more grounded, but the exhaustion had not disappeared. It never did that quickly, it only shifted, settling deeper beneath the surface, and as she waited, watching passengers line up, she replayed the last hour in her mind, not dramatically, not with resentment, but with a quiet awareness, the moment she reached out, the moment she was ignored. And the moment everything changed, and it did not feel like coincidence, not entirely, it felt like something else, something she could not fully explain, but she did not dwell on it, because her life had never allowed her to linger too long on what might have been. She focused on what was in front of her, the gate agent scanning tickets, the line moving slowly forward, the soft hum of voices blending into a familiar rhythm, and when her turn came, she stepped forward calmly, handing over her pass with steady hands, the agent glancing at it, then at her, before offering a small, polite smile. "You are all set," she said, and Hannah nodded, stepping through, her path finally clear, and as she walked down the narrow jet bridge, the enclosed space quieter, more contained, she allowed herself a small breath of relief, not a celebration. Not yet, just a moment to acknowledge that she had made it this far, and back across the terminal, Adrian had resumed movement, but not in the same way as before, his pace measured, his attention divided between the world he knew and the one he had just begun to notice. His phone buzzed again, and this time he answered, his voice returning to its usual clarity as he spoke, giving instructions, confirming decisions, stepping back into the role that defined him, but something in his tone had changed, something subtle, something that did not escape the assistant walking beside him, who glanced up briefly before looking away, sensing the difference without understanding it, and as Adrian ended the call, his gaze drifted once more toward the departure boards, scanning quickly, not for information, but for something else. Something he could not quite name, and for a second, he considered walking back, retracing his steps, not because he needed to, but because something in him wanted to, but he did not this time. Instead, he stood still, just for a moment, long enough to recognize the feeling, long enough to understand that the moment had already passed, and that what mattered now was what he did with what remained, and beside him, Sophie leaned lightly against his arm, her presence steady, her trust unchanged, and Adrian looked down at her, then back out into the moving crowd, and for the first time, he did not see it as noise to move through, but as something worth paying attention to, because somewhere in that movement, someone might be reaching out, someone might be asking for just 1 minute, and this time, he knew he would hear it. The aircraft door closed with a soft, final click, sealing the quiet shift that had already begun long before the engines would start, and Hannah settled into her seat near the window, her baby resting gently against her chest, the steady rise and fall of his breathing matching the calm she was slowly allowing herself to feel, not fully, not completely, but enough to soften the tightness that had followed her all day. She adjusted the thin blanket around him, her fingers moving with practiced care, and for a moment, she leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes just briefly, letting the hum of the cabin wrap around her like a pause she had not expected to receive, and yet even in that stillness, her mind drifted back, not to the stress, not to the fear, but to the moment someone chose to see her when she had already been overlooked, and it stayed with her, quiet but steady, not as something she needed to question, but as something she could carry forward. And miles away across the terminal, Adrian had finally returned to his private suite, the controlled silence of the space a sharp contrast to the noise he had just left behind, the glass walls reflecting a version of him that looked unchanged, composed, focused, but something beneath that surface had shifted, something subtle but persistent, and as he stepped inside, placing his phone down on the sleek table without immediately checking it, his assistant paused just inside the doorway, waiting for the usual stream of instructions, but none came right away. Instead, Adrian moved toward the window, looking out over the runway where planes lined up in quiet precision, each one following a schedule, a path, a direction that rarely changed, and for a second, he simply watched, his thoughts not on business, not on the next meeting, but on a single moment he could not rewind, a single choice he could not take back, and yet somehow, it had led to something else, something he had not planned, not controlled, And that realization did not frustrate him, it unsettled him in a way that felt necessary, and behind him, Sophie climbed onto one of the chairs, her small leg swinging slightly as she looked out the same window. "Are we going home now?" she asked, her voice calm, secure, and Adrian turned slightly, his gaze softening again as he nodded. "Yes," he said, his tone quieter than usual, and she smiled, satisfied with the answer. Her world already steady again, while his was still adjusting, still shifting in ways he had not expected, and as the engines of the plane carrying Hannah lifted her into the sky, moving her farther away from the place where everything had changed, Adrian remained standing in that quiet room, understanding for the first time that distance does not erase moments, it does not undo what has been seen or felt, it only gives space for those moments to settle, to take root. And as he reached for his phone again, finally stepping back into the life that waited for him, his movements were the same, his decisions still precise, but his awareness had changed, and somewhere between the memory of a voice asking for 1 minute and the image of a child almost lost in a crowd, he carried something new with him. Something that would not fade as quickly as everything else usually did, because some moments do not ask for attention, they demand it, and once they are seen, they do not let you go back to who you were before. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft as it cut through the night sky, and Hannah sat quietly by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her baby still asleep in her arms, unaware of how close the day had come to breaking something that could not be easily repaired, and for the first time in what felt like months, she allowed herself to sit without calculating the next step, without bracing for the next problem, just breathing, slow and steady, her hand resting gently over her child as if anchoring both of them in that moment, and though exhaustion still lingered in her bones, something lighter had taken its place beside it, something she had almost forgotten how to feel, the quiet reassurance that not everything was against her, that sometimes, even in the middle of chaos, something unexpected could shift the outcome, and she did not give it a name, she did not try to define it, she simply held on to it, because in her world, small things like that mattered more than anything else, and miles away, Adrian stood in a space filled with glass and silence, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window, the city stretching far below, every light representing movement, decisions, lives continuing without pause, and yet for him, time had slowed in a way he could not ignore, his phone resting untouched beside him, messages waiting, calls stacking, but none of it urgent enough to pull him away from the thought that had settled in his mind, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, and he replayed it again, not the moment of fear when Sophie disappeared, not the relief when he found her, but the exact second before all of it began, the second when someone reached out and he chose not to respond, and the clarity of that memory did not fade, it sharpened, revealing something he had overlooked for far too long, the pattern of dismissing what did not fit into his priorities, the habit of moving forward without looking back, and for the first time, it felt incomplete, as if something essential had been missing all along, and behind him, Sophie's quiet footsteps approached, her small presence grounding the room in a way nothing else could. "Daddy," she said softly, and he turned, his expression easing the moment he saw her, the tension he had not realized he was carrying slipping just slightly. "Yes," he answered, his voice calm but different now, less distant, more present, and she walked closer, holding up a small drawing she had been working on, simple lines, bright colors, a picture of an airport, of two figures standing near each other, one tall, one holding a baby, and Adrian looked at it carefully, taking in the details, the way children see things adults often miss, the way they capture moments not for their complexity, but for their meaning, and he recognized it instantly, not because of the accuracy, but because of the feeling behind it, and Sophie smiled slightly. "That is her," she said, pointing to the smaller figure. "She helped us," and Adrian nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the drawing longer than expected, because it was not just a picture, it was a reminder, simple and clear, of something he could not afford to forget, and as he handed it back to her, his hand paused for just a second, as if holding on to that moment before letting it go, and in that quiet room filled with nothing but reflections and distant city lights, Adrian understood that some lessons do not come from success, they come from the moments you almost missed, and the people you almost ignored, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them, no matter how far you go. Morning light moved slowly across the window of a modest apartment hundreds of miles away, soft and pale, touching the edges of a small kitchen where Hannah stood quietly, warming a bottle with careful hands, the kind of routine that had become second nature, grounding her in a life that required constant attention but offered little certainty, and yet today felt different, not because everything had changed, but because something inside her had shifted just enough to notice it, the memory of the airport still fresh, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a quiet interruption in the pattern she had grown used to, and as she turned, carrying the bottle back toward the small crib near the couch, her baby stirred slightly, his small fingers curling as she lifted him gently, her movements instinctive, steady, and for a moment, she paused, looking down at him with a softness that held both exhaustion and strength, because in her world, those two things often existed side by side. And across the city skyline in a space filled with glass and precision, Adrian sat at a long table surrounded by people waiting for decisions, voices presenting numbers, projections, strategies, the familiar rhythm of control returning in full force, and he listened, his posture composed, his expression focused, responding when needed, directing when necessary, everything moving forward exactly as it always had. And yet beneath that surface, something remained, something that did not align perfectly with the flow of the room, and as one executive finished speaking, Adrian's gaze shifted briefly, not toward the screen, but toward the window behind them. The reflection catching his attention for just a second longer than it should have, and in that second, the image of a crowded airport, a tired woman, a child crying, surfaced again, not as a distraction, but as a reminder, and when he spoke next, his voice was still clear, still decisive, but there was a difference, subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, a slight pause before each response, as if he was weighing more than just the numbers being presented, as if something beyond efficiency had entered his process, and later, as the meeting concluded and the room slowly emptied, his assistant approached with the usual updates, schedules, confirmations, but Adrian did not move immediately. He remained seated for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the table, the quiet after the conversation settling around him. And he glanced at the notepad in front of him, blank except for a single line he had written without realizing it, just 2 words, simple and direct, pay attention, and he looked at it for a moment, longer than necessary, before closing the pad and standing, his decision not announced, not explained, but understood within himself, and back in her apartment, Hannah stepped out onto a small balcony. The morning air cool but gentle, her baby resting against her shoulder, the city stretching out before her in a way that felt both overwhelming and full of possibility, and she did not know what came next, she never did, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a quiet sense that whatever it was, she would face it with something more than just endurance, something that had been there all along but had been seen, acknowledged. And in that recognition, strengthened, and as the day began in 2 very different worlds, one built on control, the other on survival, both carried the same quiet change, the kind that does not need to be spoken to shape what comes next. Weeks passed, not in dramatic shifts, but in quiet, steady movements, the kind that often go unnoticed unless you stop and look closely, and in a small apartment filled with soft morning light and the gentle sounds of a baby learning the world one breath at a time, Hannah moved through her days with the same resilience she had always carried, but now there was something else beneath it, something steadier, something that no longer felt like she was facing everything alone, and it was not because her circumstances had suddenly changed, the bills still came, the uncertainty still lingered, but because in one unexpected moment, someone had seen her, had acknowledged her existence not as a burden, but as someone worth stopping for, and that feeling stayed, quiet but powerful, shaping the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way she looked forward instead of just enduring, and across the city, in an office where decisions shaped markets and influenced lives, Adrian's world continued to move at its relentless pace, meetings filled his schedule, numbers demanded his attention, and everything around him remained as polished and precise as it had always been, but within that structure, something fundamental had shifted, not loudly, not in a way that others could easily name, but in the way he paused now, the way he listened just a little longer, the way his eyes no longer passed over the details that did not seem important at first glance, and one afternoon, as he stepped out of a building into the rush of the city, the sound reached him again, not the same, not identical, but familiar enough to stop him, a voice, strained, asking for help, and this time. He did not hesitate, he turned immediately, stepping toward it without calculation, without weighing the cost, because something within him had already made that decision days ago, and as he helped, simply, quietly, without expectation, he felt it, not as redemption, not as something to erase the past, but as something to carry forward, a choice that aligned with the person he was becoming. And later that evening, as Sophie sat beside him, drawing again with the same bright colors and simple lines, she looked up and smiled, a small, knowing expression that needed no explanation, because children do not measure change in words, they see it in actions, and Adrian met her gaze with a calm he had not felt before, the kind that does not come from control, but from understanding. And miles away, as Hannah stood by her window, watching the sky fade into evening, her baby resting peacefully in her arms, she did not know the full story of what had changed in that man's life, just as he did not know the full weight of hers, but they did not need to, because sometimes, the most important moments are not about knowing everything, they are about choosing differently when it matters, about stopping when you could walk away, about listening when it would be easier not to, and in that quiet exchange between two lives that briefly crossed, something lasting had been created, not a connection defined by names or places, but by something deeper, something that stays long after the moment passes, a reminder that kindness does not require permission, it does not wait for the right time, it simply asks to be chosen. And as the world continued to move forward, unchanged on the surface, those small choices began to ripple outward, unseen but real, shaping paths in ways no one could fully measure. And if this story leaves you with anything, let it be this, that even in the busiest places, even in the moments that seem too small to matter, you might be the one person who changes everything for someone else, and if you have ever been that person, or needed one, maybe take a moment to share it, because sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that remind us who we are meant to be.